Story number 1. The Shadow in the Locker Room. A game night mystery. Ethan, a senior on his high school soccer team, had played his heart out that evening. The game was close, but his team managed to win by a single goal in the last few minutes. Exhausted and exhilarated, he stayed behind in the locker room after everyone else had cleared out. The adrenaline rush was fading, leaving only the quiet, empty echo of the space around him, usually filled with laughter and banter. The locker room now felt eerie and uncomfortably silent. As he changed out of his gear, he began hearing faint, shuffling footsteps down the tiled hallway. Thinking a teammate might have returned for something, he called out, "Hey, who's still here?" Silence. There was no response, just the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Then he heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from a row of lockers across the room. It was subtle, almost like someone lightly scraping metal from the inside. His pulse quickened, and a chill ran down his spine. But he tried to brush it off as maybe a mouse or loose equipment shifting. But the scratching grew louder, more insistent. He glanced around the empty room, noting his teammates' bags and water bottles left lying on the benches, but no sign of anyone else. Gathering his courage, Ethan approached the row of lockers, heart pounding. "Is this some kind of prank?" he muttered, half expecting one of his friends to pop out and startle him. But as he reached for the locker door, an odd, heavy feeling settled over him, a gut instinct that he was not alone. With a deep breath, he swung the door open. Inside the locker, staring back at him, was a figure, its face shrouded in shadows, hollow eyes wide open and fixed on him with an unnerving intensity. It was motionless, almost statue-like, yet there was a strange energy to it, a quiet menace that sent a wave of fear through him. Ethan stumbled backward, unable to look away from those hollow eyes. He tried to scream, but his voice caught in his throat, paralyzed by the terror gripping him. As he backed away, the locker door slowly creaked shut, the scratching sound resuming, softer now, as if it were retreating back into the locker's depths. Ethan's breath came in quick, shallow gasps as he looked around. The bags and water bottles were still there, untouched and abandoned, as if his teammates had vanished into thin air. Realizing he had to get out, Ethan grabbed his things and bolted, his footsteps echoing down the empty halls as he raced out of the locker room. Even as he reached his car, he couldn't shake the feeling of those eyes watching him, that strange figure lurking just beyond the door. Days later, Ethan tried to talk to his friends about it, but they shrugged it off, saying he must have imagined it in the adrenaline of the game. Yet he couldn't let it go. Every time he stepped into that locker room, he felt the same creeping dread, as though something was waiting, hidden in the shadows, watching him. To this day, he avoids going back after dark, haunted by that terrifying encounter and the mystery of what really happened that night. Sometimes, things left in the locker room are better left alone, he warns. You never know who or what might still be there. Story number 2. The Forest Stalkers. A Walk to Remember. After weeks of long practices and tough games, Jake, a young football player, wanted a peaceful break. He planned a quiet night hike with his girlfriend, Mia, hoping to escape the noise and stress. They had often wandered the nearby forest trails under the moonlight, finding peace in the seclusion. That night seemed no different, just the two of them, surrounded by trees and stars, with only the sound of their footsteps on the trail. As they ventured deeper into the woods, Jake noticed a strange shift. The usual quiet of the forest felt heavier, the night air colder than usual, and then faintly they heard it. Laughter, not the playful kind, but a deep, unsettling chuckle that echoed through the trees. Jake's grip on Mia's hand tightened as he glanced around. She looked at him, her eyes wide with worry, and they slowed their pace, trying to convince themselves it was just someone else on a late-night walk. But then, shadowy figures emerged through the trees ahead of them, a group of men standing in a loose circle, muttering and shifting restlessly. They didn't appear to notice Jake and Mia at first, but the uneasy atmosphere around them sent a chill down Jake's spine. He didn't want to cause alarm, but every instinct screamed that something wasn't right. "Let's turn back," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. Mia nodded, but just as they took a step backward, one of the men looked directly at them, his gaze intense and calculating. He whispered to the others, and they all turned, their faces partially obscured by shadows, yet unmistakably filled with a disturbing intent. The men started moving toward them, slowly at first, almost casually, but with each step Jake and Mia took, the men matched their pace, quickening and narrowing the gap between them. Heart racing, Jake grabbed Mia's hand, and together they broke into a sprint, trying to retrace their steps to the main path. The laughter followed, growing louder and closer with each step. Branches clawed at their clothes as they ran, the ground uneven and slippery beneath them. Jake could feel the men gaining, their footsteps thudding ominously just behind. He chanced to look back and saw shadows flickering, looming closer. Just as they spotted the faint glow of the road up ahead, Mia tripped, her ankle twisting as she stumbled on a loose stone. Terror surging within him as they finally reached the edge of the trail. Under the streetlight's pale glow, they didn't stop running. Hearts pounding, Jake turned back one last time, swallowed by the dark trees. From that night on, the forest was no longer a place of peace for Jake and Mia. They couldn't shake the image of those men, the chilling laughter, and the haunting sense of being hunted. Jake still hears those footsteps and sees those shadowy figures in his nightmares. To this day, he warns anyone looking for a nighttime adventure. If you go wandering where you shouldn't, you might not be the only ones out there. Story number 3, The Baseball Field. Horror. When the game took a terrifying turn, it was supposed to be a casual Saturday afternoon, just a few friends gathering for a friendly baseball game at the local field. For Chris, a high school junior, it was the perfect break from the pressures of school and sports. The weather was perfect, the sky clear and blue, and there was nothing but the sound of the bat cracking against the ball as they warmed up. But as the game progressed, something began to feel off. The group of 6 friends was deep into the match, laughing and shouting as they ran the bases. That's when Chris first noticed it. Standing at the far edge of the field, just beyond the tree line, a group of men were watching the sim. At first, he assumed they were curious onlookers, or perhaps other locals enjoying the sunny day. However, the longer he stared, the more unsettling the figures became. They stood perfectly still, their faces hidden in shadow, unmoving. It felt wrong, like they weren't just there to watch. They were watching with purpose. As the game continued, Chris's unease grew. The men hadn't shifted a position, nor had they said a word. They were like silent statues, their eyes seemingly fixed on the boys. Chris tried to ignore it, but the hairs on the back of his neck prickled. Then, during a break between innings, one of the men moved. Slowly, unnervingly, he stepped forward, his long shadow stretching over the field as he approached the group. His face was obscured, hidden under the brim of a dark hat, but Chris could feel the weight of his gaze from across the field. The other figures followed him, stepping out of the trees, their movements slow and deliberate. It was then that Chris realized they weren't just standing there. They were closing in. His heart pounded in his chest as he motioned to his friends to stop. "We need to go now," he whispered urgently, panic creeping into his voice. The men hadn't said anything, but their silence was more terrifying than any words could be. The group of friends dropped their baseball bats and ran, their feet pounding against the dirt as they sprinted toward the parking lot, the men following them at a steady pace. Chris's mind raced as he glanced behind him. The men didn't run. They just walked, their steps echoing through the empty field. It felt like they were never getting closer, yet never falling behind. The boys reached the parking lot, breathless, jumping into their cars with shaky hands and locking the doors. When Chris looked out the window, the figures had stopped at the edge of the field, still watching, as if satisfied. They turned and disappeared into the trees without a sound. To this day, Chris and his friends can't explain what happened. The men never spoke, never chased them directly, yet they never felt more hunted. No one had ever seen them around town again. That baseball field, once a place of fun and games, was now a place of dread. Every time Chris drives past it, he can't shake the feeling that someone is still out there, lurking in the trees, waiting for the next group of unsuspecting. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe.